Thank you very much. Yeah, then let's get started. Welcome to my talk on behavior-driven development with Drupal and Cypress. First, a little on my person. My name is pmelab. I've been working with Drupal for the last around 15 years in combination with different other technologies, mainly React, GraphQL, and recently also Gatsby. I would call myself an automation addict. I live for the dopamine rush when something turns green. I'm the lead engineer at pmelab. I live in Austria, center of Europe. I'm a husband and father of two. I would like to kick this off with a pretty true story. So it was anonymized to protect the involved parties. But this is something that happened this way at pmelab. The project we were working on was mainly a group management tool. Think of it like the groups module, but in this case with a different data backend. And the specific task we're looking at is add an individual to a group. All we got was a screen design as our artifact to build on, which has been created by designers and the business analysts like 9 months before. And we had to figure out what the client actually needed. And we looked at this. It looked similar to what you see here. So we have the initial screen of the add an individual to a group process. It allows to search for email or name. Then we have something that's apparently a search result list. Based on the disabled buttons, we figured out that probably we're not allowed to add somebody to a group who's already in another group. And there's also an option to create a new individual. And we didn't ask too many questions because this all seemed pretty straightforward. And our solution is best described in an SQL query. So we knew that the email address is the unique identifier within the database, so it does not make sense to connect these two filters. It has to be an OR Boolean connection. And so we thought, okay, you can just type in whatever you know, and the system will just spit out all results it has. And if you find the person that you're looking for, you can add it, or else you create a new individual to add it to your group. We implemented this, we handed it over to the client, and we got our first round of feedback, which was one should not be able to add a new individual without searching. Easy enough, as long as the user did not at least search for the person, they should not be able to create a new one. The second feedback was the email input should be required, which already felt a little off, because if this is just filtering, why should one of the filters be required? But we just did as we were told. And then feedback number 3 came in, which was if the email input matches, it should be the only result, and it should not be possible to create a new individual. And that's where it dawned on us that we were misunderstanding something completely. And because this kind of splits the search process into 2, because we first have to check if we have somebody that matches that email, and then we would just search for the name. And the lesson we learned is that we were missing crucial context here before we started to implement. Because in the past, duplicated entries of individuals have been the major problem. And this interface was designed to solve that. The problem is nobody told us. So granted, this is not a problem that would fail a project, but you seldomly these misunderstandings do. The problem is more that you have like hundreds of these small misunderstandings and miscommunications that just add up. So we were trying to improve our communication and see how we can avoid these situations. And that's where the topic of our talk comes in: behavior-driven development with Gherkin, and then also with Drupal and Cypress, which I think is the most misunderstood concept in the history of computing. That's where my little try of a poll comes in. Who already, so if you're voluntarily here, there's a good chance that you already heard about behavior-driven development, Gherkin, Behat. Is anybody in here who never touched this topic at all? Then try to raise your hand if you know where the controls are. I don't. Okay, looks good. So just to sum it up, this is about describing your feature and its requirements by writing scenarios that follow a specific structure, which is given a precondition, when, then the user's interaction, then the expected outcome. And there are a lot of tools for almost any language to interpret this structured language to express features. I think the only language that I did not find was Lisp. If you search for Gherkin and Lisp, you find a Lisp interpreter that is written in Bash, which is very confusing. But if you work a lot with Lisp, I think you're used to confusion. And what all these systems, like Behat is one of them, which is the implementation for Gherkin in PHP. Also often do is bring predefined step definitions that can be reused. Something like user clicks on button X and you just have to fill in the X, and you reuse this generic step over and over again. And that unfortunately is the beginning of the end, because if you put something like that into hands of developers, you very likely end up with this. This is, technically speaking, a behavior-driven or a Gherkin scenario, but it completely fails all the objectives that behavior-driven development tries to achieve. So it obviously was written after the implementation, or how else do we know that our page, the page we're talking about, is at group number/add. It's highly bound to the UI and the implementation. It's very brittle because as soon as we change anything in our implementation, it will immediately break. And what's more important, it has no documentation value, because that's what behavior-driven development and these scenarios are all about. They're about communicating the goal and the intent of what we're implementing. And if you put it that way, it's more an integration test without the benefit of a clear syntax that you would have if you just implemented this in PHP or JavaScript right away. And so it combines the worst of both worlds. So you have like the brittleness of an hard-coded test implementation together with the fuzziness of human language, and put a layer of regex-based indirection on top, kind of as the cherry. So how can we avoid that? And I have a couple of tips. So rule number 1 is to never call these scenarios tests, call them examples. That's important for everybody else in the team, because as soon as you talk about tests, everybody will put this down the line, because that's the responsibility of the developers. But what you actually want is usage examples that you can base your assumptions on. And as soon as you start calling it that way, this also paves the way for rule number 2, which is these examples come first. They are not something that developers write when they start to implement the application. They should be the result of the exploration phase at the very beginning, where you define what problem you are about to solve. And the most important part here is, and that's what I've seen most often go wrong, is that they should be defined before the designs. They are the definition designs have to be based on, because they define the problem. And if you do it the other way, and that's unfortunately happened a couple of times, very often you fall into the trap to base your scenarios off the screen designs, and very often they are even written to match the designs and make sure that the implementation is conforms to the design, but that's not the goal, and this is also something that most likely will go wrong. Rule number 3, apply the correct tense. So in our example before, every sentence or every line was written in the present, but humans unconsciously digest information about time in language, and it helps us to put things into order. So given steps should always be written in the past. When steps should be written in the present, so what the user does right now. And the then steps should be written either in future or normative tense. So either something that is going to happen or something that should happen. Rule number 4, give them faces. That's about your example data, because a developer is already pretty bad at thinking in abstractions, and the average human mind is even worse. And it's hard to communicate about user A, B, C that has these and that properties and keep this in everybody's mind. And one thing that we made very good experiences with is to really create personas that we use throughout the project, and we really give them faces, like put the stock photo on them so people have a picture in mind, and also connect this picture to the person's capabilities, like, okay, this is the administrator, this is some other role in the project or in our application. And this allows us to leverage our social processing unit somewhere in our brain to easier make connections and find out gaps in our assumptions when discussing scenarios and discussing the use cases of our software. And last but not least, it's a great way to sneak pop culture references into your projects. And rule number 5 is thinking in screenplays. I'm referencing here the screenplay pattern, which we will not go into very much detail. The screenplay pattern is a concept for organizing and writing your test code as well. But I just want to scratch the surface here, because it also encourages to hit the right level of abstraction when writing scenarios. So you should always map or write in interactions, and then an interaction is either a task or a question, where a task modifies the current system state and the question retrieves this state. And if you keep that level, there's a pretty good chance that you get it right. So for an example, just entering text in our search for name field does not change the system state. This is not an action, so it should also not have its own sentence in our scenario. Neither is clicking the button, but both of them are an interaction that change the state of the overall system and will bring back our search result list, and therefore allow a question of what is in there. And that's where the screenplay pattern already helps on a conceptual level. So if we eat our own dog food and pack all of this into a scenario, or rewrite our scenario that we had before for group management, that's our possible outcome. So in the beginning, I've set a background definition. The background is a set of preconditions that apply for every scenario. And this sets basically our baseline. So in this case, we have a user called Janice, who is administrator of the group Club 27. And there is a user called Kurt, who is also a registered user, but not a member of Club 27. And the email address of Kurt is kurt@nirvana.com. So that's known information that's already in our system. So the first scenario, add user with an unknown email. Here, the first precondition is especially interesting since it does not define the state of our system, but it defines the state of our user, which is very important. So given Janice thinks that Kurt's email is kurt@pearljam.com, which is a forgivable mistake. So Janice has not been alive anymore in the 90s, and St. Peter's just told her, hey, there's a new guy called Kurt coming in, and he's been playing in the hippest band right now. And Janice doesn't know, and she just Googles hip bands, and she ends up with Pearl Jam, and that's how this mistakes happen. And we end up here with somebody entering a wrong email address into our system. So when she attempts to add Kurt to the group Club 27, so we are not describing our user interface in this case, but we describe with which mental precondition the user approaches our system and what the user is about to do. But we don't make any assumptions on how the interface solves that. So it's not, we don't talk about a form field or a button to submit, because this could as well happen through a voice interface or whatever other solution you could come up with. And then the then step, the system suggests to add the individual with email kurt@nirvana.com. So that's the important part where our interface accepted the name and the wrong email address, discarded the email address because it didn't find anything for that, but then searched for the name. And in this case, last sentence, but she also has the option to create a new individual. This means in this case, we want the add new individual button to be present, because we found somebody that might match her criteria, but we're not completely sure. Second scenario, the main difference is the different mental precondition that Janice has. In this case, she knows for sure, and she's right, that the email address is kurt@nirvana.com. And when she attempts to add Kurt to the group, then the system suggests in this case to add kurt@nirvana.com, and in this scenario there is no option to create a new individual because we have an email match, and this we know that this is exactly this person, and to avoid any duplicate input we're not even going to allow it. And this scenario conveys all the information that we would have needed in the very beginning to properly implement or to properly solve the problem that our client initially was out for. Okay, this was a lot about like the human side of behavior-driven development. And I think that's the more important one, because we've always been good at implementing these tests, but we've never been good at writing these scenarios in a way that they actually help. So where does this fit in? We have our testing pyramid with unit tests at the bottom, then component tests, integration tests, API tests, end-to-end tests, and on top, this ominous Eye of Sauron, which is our real users or QA staff doing exploratory testing. And hopefully that's the only one that's done manually. And these behavior tests fit in here at the automated end-to-end tests. And interestingly, they're also very often used for API testing. This works if you write your scenarios properly and UI or user interface agnostic, because then you're able to also just implement these abstract steps against your API directly, be it like an actual REST or GraphQL API or your API in form of service container classes. And you can make sure that your system meets these requirements on a lower level, and then you can also implement these tests for different user interfaces. So it would be possible to implement the same scenario for your web interface and for your smartphone application and for your voice interface that is connected to Echo or Siri. And therefore get the most out of the scenarios, because the behavior of your application should be the same everywhere. Still, we are at DrupalCon or Drupal GovCon. So where does Drupal come into play? Right now, we have developed and published a module for Drupal that integrates Cypress. You can think of it, at least the behavior-driven part, similar to the Behat module, but with the benefits of Cypress. What does the module do for you? You can write module-level tests, so tests that are integrated into your module and only test this one module. And they're similar to the JavaScript tests that we already have in Drupal core, but with the benefits of Cypress, with all time traveling and test management and the ease of implementing end-to-end tests there. Then you can also write project level tests, which can take your whole configuration folder and start a test run based on that. So you can run end-to-end tests against the full application. And something we added there in addition, so this is all based on the Drupal's built-in testing framework, but we added an install caching feature. So if you run these tests against the local SQLite database, the test runner will automatically create caches of the install process and just bring this up quickly so the tests run really fast. You can write both standard Cypress tests as well as behavior-driven or behavior tests, as we showed them throughout the whole talk now. A standard Cypress test looks like what we see on the bottom left corner. So it's more standard JavaScript testing syntax with these specific Cypress commands that operate the browser. And so how to get started? It's pretty easy. Just if you're running on a composer-based Drupal project, just require the Drupal Cypress package as well as the Drupal core development libraries. Enable the module, which is something you don't have to do in production. It's not a security risk per se, because so the Cypress module opens some access points for Cypress itself to speed up tests in some cases, but they are automatically disabled unless you try really hard. But the safest way is just to all out disable it in production. Then you start just a server, you can just use drush serve or your local Apache or whatnot. By default, the Cypress module will try to run the tests against port 8889, which is configurable. And then you can just use drush to run the tests, which are inside the Cypress module, which will verify that the whole installation worked. So we're going to implement our first own test. If you just want to write tests for your whole project and bring in all the goodness of behavior-driven development, the easiest way is to just create a features folder in your project root, where you put in a feature file like this homepage.feature, and you apply all the tips that I gave you to create a really speaking feature like this one, where we don't navigate to a specific path, but we actually illustrate how somebody could hear about Amazing Labs at GovCon and is very interested, and then visits our website and sees or learns what we do and what's our core focus. Then you create a new folder within features with the same name as the feature file itself. And in there, you can just drop as many JavaScript files as you want. They will all be picked up. And that's where you write your step definitions and how they are executed by Cypress. This is a very trimmed down example. The first line is important because this triggers Drupal to be installed before the test is run. You can here define a profile. You can define your config directory. It's also possible to set an installer class like the Drupal core JavaScript tests do. You can read this up in the API documentation if you're interested. Then the second step here is interesting because if you write tests for humans, it's very likely that some of these steps you actually don't want to really implement when they're automated. Like in our scenario, we illustrate that somebody has heard about Amazing Labs and uses a search engine to search to find more about it, and then clicks on the first result item. We don't really want to automate this step through Google unless we want to test the capabilities of our marketing team. But in a technical test, we actually just skip the whole Google part, and we just step in where the user follows the first result item, which is in our case, we assume that the person ends up at our homepage. So we just visit /. And then an example implementation of checking that all the important keywords are on the homepage somewhere readable. So it will search for the free words that are captured by the regular expression, which would be Drupal, React, and Gatsby. And the test will just assert that these come up on our homepage. Now to run this test, make sure that the test server is running again, and run drush Cypress open, which will bring up the Cypress interface as you see it on the right. And from there, you can then run your tests, do all the Cypress step debugging and watching your application unfold. Okay, so on further reading, since all of this is an introduction and I tried to focus on the part that I think is the most complicated and the easiest to get wrong part, which is communicating and writing good scenarios. So there is the website Cucumber.io, which is basically the company behind Cucumber, which is they provide the implementation of Gherkin in JavaScript and in many other languages, and also do training on behavior-driven development, provide some other tools around that. And there's a lot of information that's interesting. Then there is the book Behavior-Driven Development with Cucumber, which helped me a lot to get deeper into this topic. And it's interesting because it's not a technical book, so I also recommend it to any project managers or decision-making people that want to know what it's about, because it's more written as a story of a company getting into behavior-driven development and seeing its benefits and also the pitfalls. Then on Cypress and test automation in general, there is Cypress.io. If you want to know what is Cypress, what are the benefits, it's one of the best documented tools out there. And as an addition that we also included into the Cypress module for Drupal is the Cypress testing library, which is a library of predefined Cypress commands that encourage good testing practices, as we've seen in the test implementation before, the find by text. So these are all helpers that encourage you to implement your tests as if it was a user. So you should, for example, not target IDs or elements by classes, but rather by get form element by label, or find something by text. So really interact with the website as a normal user would do, which will also immediately bring up accessibility problems, for example. Then the screenplay pattern, which is a topic that would deserve a talk on its own. There is the initial article by Andy Palmer and Anthony Marcano. Then a good article series on cucumber.io, and the Cypress screenplay package, which is also bundled with the Cypress module for Drupal, that allows you to write your interactions in a solid way. Go look at the documentation there if you're interested in how to organize your test code in detail. And then last but not least, the Cypress module for Drupal itself. I linked the documentation website, as well as a webinar that I did some time ago, but that goes deeper into how to actually the coding aspect of writing tests in Cypress for your Drupal website. And that's it so far. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm open for questions.
Thanks, Philip. That was awesome. Some questions that came in along the way were answered by your slides. Does anyone else? Oh, let's see. Here we go. Danielle asks, what roles on a team are usually doing the different steps of this process?
Good question. Everybody. So the important part is that these scenarios are not something that should be thrown over the fence, but it's a point of collaboration, and it's also something that evolves over time and over the project. And that's also its purpose, because it should be kind of a living documentation. And what we have seen is that just on the practical side, we rarely have the time to fully flesh out scenarios beforehand. So we rather opted to defining perhaps just the scenario outlines to get the brief idea of what do we need to cover, and then developers start to write the scenarios. So we can also split this, because if you just have one product owner writing all those scenarios, it's it's going to be your bottleneck, and most of them couldn't deal with all of that. And you also get the benefit of a safety check, because if a developer writes the scenario and then it goes back to the product owner and the product owner confirms, okay, we're on the same page here, then you're in a pretty good spot for actually starting and implementing.
Okay, a couple more questions. Brooke asks, so big picture, what is the advantage or advantages of using Cypress versus just basic Behat?
First thing, Cypress is agnostic to the implementing architecture because it really just accesses HTTP. You can also do this with Behat and the Mink extension. But in our case, at least, we also do a lot of Jamstack work, and we can just use the same testing tool everywhere. And the developers that write these tests don't necessarily have to know PHP. That's one aspect. The other aspect is simply the awesomeness of Cypress. There is hands down no other tool that brings that level of developer experience, because you have to try it yourself, but you can watch your application step through your test. And after the test is finished, you can actually make it go back to a certain point, and it did a dump snapshot, and you can see how the user interacted, or your fictional user interacted with the application, and you can retrospectively catch bugs in there or see in which state the application was somewhere mid-test. I think that's the biggest benefit. And also it's great documentation and very intuitive API for writing the tests.
Okay, thanks. Brooke also asks, are you using this with a CI tool like Circle CI, etc.?
Yes, we are running our tests in Travis, then some of them run on client projects in TeamCity, on GitHub Actions. They work everywhere.
Okay, and with that, I want to thank Philip for presenting today, and thanks everyone for attending and coming. And I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks again.